English Literature Poetry, My Last Duchess. So some general advice on the anthology in the videos which you've got available to you. Don't focus on what you can't do. You're not expected to do material. Use the time to revise and prepare revision materials. These will be incredibly useful in Year 11. Revision cards with quotation, poems involved. And then at the third point, set to achieve and do them. So if you set out to write revision cards, you get it done, so they're good materials to come back to in year. And then also try a variety of different activities. You might decide to just do some online tasks through Seneca or Sam Learning one day, and then try some written work the next day, followed by a day of making revision materials. So again, that could be cards as well. So whatever it is you're doing, make sure it's worthwhile to build your knowledge of the answer. And here we have the set tasks as well. So again, on the shared area, more shared area, we have some information to do with Year 10 home learning and also Year 11 students revision aids as well. That's available on the Q drive through Pedmore. We have Sam Learning available to you as well, which you've used before. And we have Seneca Learning as well. Now this would have been given to you if you have a class code and you have to sign up as a student. Okay, so lots of useful poetry resources on there. And BBC Bite Size is there for you to use as well, another very useful resource. For you to do with you what the poem is about, each of the 15 poems, link to other poems using themes and contextual knowledge, learning quotations, that obviously involves annotation of language, structure, building up revision cards, and then to challenge yourself, so explore wider reading, so things like the British Library, in each poem. There are some resources here in the home learning folder to help you with that as well. Okay, so onto our poem, My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. As you can see, it's one of the longest poems in the anthology, so what we've done is divided it up into two parts. So you can see the first half here. What I'll do is read the poem through first of all, and then come back and do some annotation and language and structure later on of the poem itself. Okay. That's My Last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. For our Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, she stands. Will please you sit and look at her? I said for our Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest, but to myself they turned. Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I, and seemed as they would ask me if they came there. So, not the first, are you to turn and ask thus, Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only cooled that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush white. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon mad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So 'twas all one. My favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bow of cherries, some officious fool, broke an orchard for her, the white mule. She rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gifts. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse. Even then I'm stooping, and I choose never to. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, but who passed without much thought? I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if, wilt please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the county your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. Though he disallowed at starting is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. No taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So as you can see, an extremely long poem, and I think the form of the poem itself obviously had an influence on how the message would have been delivered. Okay? So I think the first thing to do is discuss who this Duke is and who he's referring to by the Duchess. Well, the Duke is loosely based on the Duke of Ferrara, so he was an important figure, and he would have been obviously very rich, lived in a mansion, had a lot of power, and he was quite well known as well, so he obviously lived up to his Duke status. And implied that he killed or had the Duchess killed. So in other words, his former wife he had killed because of his jealousy, which we'll explore later on in the poem. But what's actually happening here in terms of the actual scene and the physical sort of delivery of this poem is the Duke is talking to a messenger or an emissary from another family, the family he'd be married into. So he's talking about his life and he's talking about where he lives and the things which are inside his house, and also as a form of warning to Duchess, who's now deceased. Okay. As a result, we can see a lot of the language is geared towards the Duke himself, so he comes across as quite an egotistical character in the. For example, the poem is littered with possessive pronouns: my, I, and there's a lot of me as well. It's all self-centered towards the Duke himself rather than anybody else or anything else. Like Duchess paints a painting, which you may see on the first slide. It's a painting of the Duchess and the fact she's suspended in this sort of. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. The caesura is used here in the second line, which is where we've got a stop in the middle of the line, which draws attention to the fact that, okay, she is no longer alive. So we start to learn the backstory already from that caesura in the second line. I call that piece of wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Frau Pandolf is actually the artist who would have put this painting together. And you notice how Frau Pandolf is mentioned 2 or 3 times in the first half of the poem. It seems that the Duke himself cares more about the artist and the actual thing rather than the actual person who the subject of the painting is. Okay. Frau Pandolf's hands work busily a day, and there she stands. She stands on personification there, so personification in line 4. It's not very much about the Duchess, it's about the painting itself. The painting is personified. Wilt please you sit and look at her? There, the Duke is asking a rhetorical question. But in actual fact, it's more like an order, isn't it? Because he's ordering this person, this messenger, to do certain things and look at certain things. He's sort of orchestrating this meeting they're having, a rhetorical question there as well. I said Frau Pandolf by design, repetition, Frau Pandolf, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. That noun phrase there, earnest glance. But to myself, again, myself, we have a possessive pronoun. They turned, since not but by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. Okay. As you may notice, this poem is extremely wordy. Okay, difficult to read out loud in one go, I would suggest, but if you pick it apart, you can see exactly how the message is being delivered. As you might have seen in the first slide of this presentation, we can see that there's a painting, but there's actually a curtain in front of it. The curtain is metaphorical because the curtain is there to control, for the Duke to control who sees this painting. And it's metaphorical because it represents the relationship that he had with his Duchess. He wants to control who sees and in turn who she may see. So the curtain is there as a symbol of the control he wished to have over her. Since none puts by the curtain, I have drawn with these singular possessive pronouns, I, myself. And it seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus against Azura. He's sort of inviting the messenger into the plot and sort of saying, well, you're not the first person to ask this, so I'll go into the story now. Okay, into the second quarter of the poem, he starts to tell the story of his wife in much more detail. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only, called the spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. He's starting to the promiscuous nature of the Duchess. Wasn't her husband's presence only. The Duchess seems to with other men. Well, that's in fact the way the Duke sees it. Okay, her husband's presence only. Perhaps Frau Pandolf, again it's a bit of Pandolf dropped in again. Chance to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. Or, ain't must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. Dies along her throat. Obviously we've got connotations there of death, the Duchess, which is alluded to here. And again, caesura to bring our attention. Whenever we have a caesura in this poem, with a full stop halfway through a line or partway through a line, something important is sort of being drawn to our attention. A very violent image in this case. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. How shall I say? Too soon made glad, too easily impressed. Just pausing there. So too soon made glad, too easily impressed. We've got repetition of too. And again, here's the Duke making a judgment about the Duchess's behaviour. Too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She was easily satisfied by those around her, whether it was other people, males, people she socialised with. The Duke was not approving of the Duchess's life. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. She seemed to look at other men, in other words. Sir, 'twas my favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west. Just to pause here. Dropping of the daylight, alliteration we have, and also connotations of darkness and perhaps purity being washed away. And that's where we have the Duke bring himself. When he comes to the end of the day, she will meet her demise. Then we have the bow of cherries, some officious fool, broke in the orchard for her, the white mule. Just pause there before we go to the second half. Officious fool. Again, it's a noun phrase to describe one of the men or one of the people that the Duchess socialised with, that she associated with. The bow of cherries, some officious fool. Again, making out that the person that's the Duchess spent time with, or one of them, was foolish and sort of, well, not very wise, let's say. So that noun phrase, very telling. That's the Duke making another judgment about the Duchess's lifestyle and how she spent her time. Okay, on to the second half. Here we go. She rode, we're referring to the mule here once again. She rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. Okay, you can sense from this caesura, again, something important happening. This is where the Duke thoughts of jealousy. Okay, she rode around the terrace, parading around. on this ground which the Duke owns. All and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. So the Duke's jealousy is expressed. The Duchess is parading around without the Duke. These men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name. 900 years old name, that's obviously the name of the Duke himself. Once they were married, the Duke and the Duchess, the Duke's name. He saw it as a bit of a gift, my gift of a 900 years old name. So there's obviously a symbol of tradition there, honour, almost like a reward, a 900 years old name. It's the idea that the Duke would be very proud to give his name away, but his gift implies that she didn't really care for it, she just saw it as any other gift, like the bow of cherries, for example. She didn't see the Duke as very special at all. That would have made her jealous, apparently. My gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gifts. Again, very subtly, we've got a possessive pronoun, my, once again. Very important quote. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Again, caesura. So much quicker, broken up and be more fragmented, more angry, short-tempered. Had you skill in speech, which I have not. This quotation later on because it's vital and it's very subtle as well, which I have not. To make your will quite clear to what such and one, and say, just this or that, and you disgust me. Here you miss, or there it's C mark. Again, this quotation here, for example, it's discussing the fury and the rage and the frenetic energy part of this poem here. The Duke is extremely jealous and he's ready to take action, which we'll see in a moment. And if she let herself and so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping. I choose never to stoop. It would be lowering someone down. So again, connecting to our status of the name, the 900 years old name, we've got stoop to be with the lower classes. And it seems like the Duke cares only about class and this gift of a name. And again, caesura listed in here as well. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, who passed without much the same smile. So here, the Duke is referring to the conversation itself and referring to the messenger and saying, oh, sir, and she smiled, no doubt. He's almost defending his own actions. So I'm going to go to the S here. We've got a lot of sibilance. As we build up to the bit of a bombshell, which comes in a moment, a lot of sibilance. And you can see from the commas here, pieces, we're building tension towards a bit of vital information very soon. Oh, sir, she passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? Again, caesura. This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. So we can see that this sibilance builds the pace, builds momentum, of the plot of the poem, if you like. We have, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. It's implied that the Duke had the Duchess killed. I gave commands, which implies, again, first person, I gave commands, he was responsible. He's saying that he ordered the Duchess killed. And again, caesura. Something very important just been told to us, therefore caesura, to draw our attention to it. There she stands alive. Again, referring to the trait rather than the shadow. Wilt please you rise? We'll meet the company below then, I repeat. The Count your master's known munificence. So munificence means generosity or value. It's ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed, as starting is my object. So here, the Duke is referring to the idea of marrying to another family. Okay, so once he's dealt with this information, the pace sort of slows down. It's much more like prose. Okay, so there's not so much caesura, it's not so much sibilance to build pace. It's much slower, and it's sort of a relief of that tension from earlier on. He's talking about what the next step shall be. Okay, just to touch on the final metaphor here. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune. So Neptune, god of the sea, I believe, though taming a seahorse. So obviously Neptune would have had, certainly to an audience of that time, connotations of a giant, okay, someone who's incredibly powerful and overbearing. Somebody like the Duke, in terms of a physical embodiment, though taming a seahorse. So what's happening here, the Duke's comparing himself to this godlike figure of Neptune, and he's referring to the seahorse as Duchess herself, someone who's very weak, fragile, someone you could crush with very little force. But he's projecting himself as the Duchess herself, so obviously a huge contrast there. That's a really important metaphor for the Duke's insecurity, because he doesn't need to be powerful enough as powerful as a god to destroy or kill a seahorse, but he's sort of exaggerating his own power, and exaggerating indeed the Duchess's weakness. And just to confirm what this object is as well, in the mansion, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me, again another artist. So Klaus of Innsbruck would have been a sculptor who cast in bronze. So it's so the theme again. We started with a portrait, so obviously a physical object representing somebody. So it's another physical object, the statue, the bronze statue of this Neptune figure. So it seems as though the Duke cares more about physical objects rather than people and their feelings and things which actually matter. Okay, we'll refer back to this line here as well. Even had you skill in speech, which I have not. But it's almost a bit of deception on the Duke's part here, because he's saying that he's got no skill in speech. But if you notice the length of the poem, it's in a dramatic monologue form, it's in iambic pentameter. He has got skill in speech. He's got lots of sort of deceptive elements where he's delivering this message very cleverly. Okay, and he's using metaphor all the way as well. And not to mention, we've got rhyming couplets all the way through the poem. So clearly, there's a deception going on here. He's trying to present himself as somebody who's not very skilled, not very intelligent, but underneath the surface, he's being very deceptive. Okay, so to understanding of this poem, which is obviously quite a complex poem, it's a narrative poem as well, so it's got a definitive storyline to it. And the best thing to do to sort of enhance your knowledge would be to summarise what the poem is all about in full sentences, annotate the poem itself as well with points you can remember from your initial study, and any responses and ideas you have. And when it comes to alternates, it's worth looking at what your initial notes say about the poem, and then thinking about what was Browning trying to say about control. Talking about how your interpretations may have changed over time. Also, you can select 3 or 4 quotations which you like the look of and explode them. So that means obviously going into alternative interpretations, connotations of single words, what the poet may have been trying to do, and then any techniques such as metaphors, symbolisms, and so on. Just trying to get as much detail out of each quotation as possible. And something which I touched on briefly in the annotation just then, think about the form and structure. So the poem had been written in rhyming couplets. Well, perhaps you could say, for example, the there because it doesn't allow for any interruption, and it again enforcing the control and the power of the Duke. And just to look into the form as well, the final activity here. Can you say anything about the poem's form and how it appears on the page? What do you notice about the rhyme scheme? And also, can the monologue be divided into parts, and the sort of narrative and the storyline, if you like, of the poem? Interpreting the poem's form. So these are all tasks which you can And also, you can look at some contextual research. So try and find out about, obviously, Robert Browning, his intentions, and a bit of his background, what he's right about this Duke, this jealous figure, obviously part of a patriarchal society. And also the speaker himself, because uniquely as part of the anthology, it's based on a real person, or loosely based on a real person. So the speaker himself, the Duke, who was he? Look into the Romantic era and conventions of relationships between men and women, perhaps. What were Romantic poets known for? How does the structure and content of this poem reflect these ideas? So plenty to work with and the meaning of the poem itself. And we also have the resource of the British Library online, which you can find, and you can find articles to do with the background or intentions of the poet itself. So lots in there to explore and get knowledge of this poem. Okay, so time to think about links. How can this poem compare and connect to other poems in the anthology? Well, to begin with, think about the idea of control and power. Well, the first poem would probably say this because it's about a singular voice, isn't it? It's about one person, one male figure at the centre, almost a character of the poem. So you could do a powerful figure such as Ozymandias and what he wanted to project, how he wanted to appear to his audience, for example, then compare that to the Duke himself. That's a really good comparison. And obviously, to connect to that as well, you could discuss the idea of pride. So perhaps the poem like London, because London is the powerful, it's the capital of Britain, and certainly during Britain it is a powerful in the Western world. Well, perhaps you could do a comparison between the powerful figure of place of London itself, but then also perhaps look for the weaknesses within it and how it's really received by an audience and by people reading the poem at the time. And on the subject of pride as well, perhaps you look at Charge of the Light, because it's the idea of false pride and false power, something which seems to be very powerful and full of momentum, but in actual fact is full of weakness, insecurity, and ultimately a defeat of sorts. If you want to discuss the voice of the poem as well, you could refer to something like Remains, because it's one person's experience, one voice delivering a message. How the person's voice may appear weak or affected badly by their experience. And obviously you have to check out history as well, which is another very personal experience, and how the Duke can compare with the figure from that poem. Look at the potential exam question relating to My Last Duchess. So, as in any exam question, it refers to the keywords of the question, the focus of the question. So in this case, the power of people. So sort of spend some time about which one. And if you were to attempt an answer at this question, I'll explain exactly how you can plan and put together an answer. For example, you could look at Ozymandias, and you could think about how he is powerful, and also, in fact, how they were later seen as weak or damaged in some way. So lots of depth referring to My Last Duchess as well as Ozymandias in terms of this answer. So the plan for this answer would be looking at the first poem, My Last Duchess, and dividing your page into two. And once you divide your page into two, you can make a list of points about himself. How is he described as powerful in terms of the language, the actual delivery and the structure of the poem itself as well? Then obviously going over the page and looking at points from Ozymandias or somebody else. What you're looking to do is create 3 points using quotations. The left-hand page for the Ozymandias character. And then once you can then get on with your introduction. So once that 5 minutes is done, you can start. The way to do that is explain how the keywords of the question can fit into your answer. So how exactly the power of people is presented in this poem versus the poem. and then you can get into P paragraphs. So once you've done the introduction, your P paragraphs should alternate. So if you ask My Last Duchess, the other poem, for example, Ozymandias, it should be comparisons among your paragraphs all the way through. We recommend that you write 3 PA paragraphs per poem as well, so a total of 6 in the sign aloud. And then to follow that as well, you're looking at a conclusion which obviously sums up your ideas and makes a bit of a judgment into the most effective methods. But the main thing is the depth of the PA paragraphs. The way to do that and way to do paragraphs would be, which you would have used at length before, and also start to go into as much depth as possible and think about the bigger questions about things like gender, control, relating to this poem and the one you wish to compare to. Okay, so looking at the mark scheme, this is obviously designed for poetry itself, the anthology. So for AO1, there's a maximum of 12 marks, AO2 also 12 marks, and AO3 is 6 marks. That's where you get your context. Okay, and that's in this table here. So we can see level 6, we're looking at the keywords here. So convincing and critical analysis and exploration. That's where we start to explore the bigger ideas beneath the poem and why exactly the poem has chosen certain methods and what their effects are. Okay, as much depth as possible. This is where we get into our PA paragraphs, and if they're thoroughly written and they're exploring connotations in detail, alternative interpretations, writer's intention, we can certainly aim for these sort of keywords when we're describing our own work. Level 6, convincing critical analysis and exploration. We have thoughtful, developed consideration. The way to identify a developed answer would be looking at things like keywords. How do connotations of single words? Okay. Last Duchess was a word. Why that word would have been chosen? In the context of a patriarchal society. That's the way you can get into thoughtful and developed. It's showing you've not just dealt with a certain word, but you've actually dealt beneath it as well. Okay, and onto our second page of our mark scheme here, we've got clear understanding, level 4, and explained and structured comments. Okay, as long as you're writing detailed PA paragraphs and you're writing comparisons, don't forget about the 2 poems you write about, you can certainly aim to get at least half marks. If you get half marks, we recommend that's obviously going to get you your pass, but once you start to get into this section here, 11 to 50 marks, you can certainly aim to get the next one quite easily. And relevant comparison. Okay, so a quick reminder of the task which you are able to do. So you can research the poems and develop your knowledge even further by looking at the home learning and your year 11 Q drive on the Pedmore shared area. You can use SAM learning to answer questions and develop your knowledge further as well. And I'll use Seneca learning as well, from which you would have been given a class code and you can log in as a student to have your own account. So 2 very useful resources there, as well as BBC Bite Size, which gives you a very detailed breakdown of each poem as well. Okay. So what we're looking for you to do is be able to explain what the poem is all about, link the poem to different themes and ideas, choose, annotate and learn 3 key quotations from each poem, and then create those at your disposal as well. Your reading, so the British Library, which we recommended, and contextual information as well. So there are some resources here for you as well. And finally, just to reiterate, you can always email your teacher with any questions, with any support with any poems at all that you're not sure of. And also proactively try and send us your work as well. So share any good work that you are doing, you've been up to.